So Dr. Shike, Dr. Shike is a clinical assistant professor of medicine at the University of Washington and an outpatient provider at the Hobson Clinic. She earned her master's in social psychology prior to medical school and her MD at Weill Cornell Medical College and did her residency in internal medicine here at the University of Washington. During residency, she also completed training in the HIV pathway and later went on to serve as the chief resident and clinician teacher fellow at the VA. She's been a passionate member in the University of Washington community with regard to healthcare equity, both through clinical work as well as in teaching students and trainees about the effects of racism and implicit bias in our healthcare system. She was actually one of the original members of the Residency Diversity Task Force, which is now the RDC, and served on the Department of Medicine's Diversity Council. She's been invited to speak at various events, including the University of Washington Grand Rounds, the Harborview Ethics Forum, and the Mountain West AIDS Education and Training Center's Project ECHO. So we're really excited to have her today and talk with us about race and medicine. Thanks so much, Dr. Shike, for being here. I will turn it over to you.
Hi guys, can you all see my screen okay? You can, okay. So while I'm going through this talk, please feel free to jump in with questions in the chat. I'm not always great about checking the chat, so if there are questions coming up that I'm not seeing and not answering someone, please feel free to just speak up. I know some of you have heard this talk before, and my hope is that in hearing it a couple of times, you'll be able to sort of pick out and grapple with different aspects of it. So I hope it'll be useful, even if it's not the first time hearing it for some of you. Okay, so let's get started. I have no disclosures. So learning objectives for today. So we'll start out by defining race. In order to define race, we'll talk about what race is not, including how it is not equivalent to nor a good proxy for genetics or ancestry. We'll talk about some of the problems with how we use the concept of race as a variable in medicine. And then we'll talk about how we can use the concept of race to illuminate the underpinnings of inequity, so in a beneficial way, while also avoiding uses that perpetuate this harmful notion that race is a surrogate for some sort of biological factor. So I think it's really important in talking about race in medicine and racism in medicine to acknowledge that in the medical community, like in any community, we have a language and a culture that underpins everything that we do. And that language and that culture is very, very heavily connected to our hundreds of years of history. That's how it became interwoven in the fabric of our community. And that's important because that acknowledges that it's seeped into so many different aspects of what we do, and also acknowledges that it's very sort of difficult and cumbersome to undo something that is woven into our fabric to that degree. You guys are just starting out on your journey in the medical community. And so that's a hugely beneficial aspect of your identity as new physicians. You guys haven't yet been indoctrinated into this way of thinking. And you guys are sort of coming into this at a time when we're really starting to think differently. So you won't have developed that sort of language and pattern of thinking that's really, really harmful that a lot of those of us who've been doing this for a little bit longer, and especially folks in our community who've been doing this for decades, have been really, really indoctrinated into. So I say this to sort of encourage you all, first of all, to feel pride in the fact that you have the opportunity to do things totally differently, and also to ask for sort of patience and recognition that there are some complexities in encouraging the older generations to start to think differently and do things differently. I do think we can expect and hope for people to change, but it is cumbersome in a way for people who've been doing this for decades that it's not for you guys, which is really great. So you guys are going to be the teachers and the change makers in this area. So starting with the definition, what is race? So race captures a lifelong social experience. I like this definition. It's pretty general, but I think it's really true. And we'll go through, more importantly, what race is not next. So let's all put on our sort of anthropologist hats to understand some aspects of race and human migration in the early days of human existence. So a couple of things that you guys are going to need to know to understand the animation that I'm going to show you right now, which I'm realizing is not going to work in the way that I have this opened. Let's switch to presentation mode. Okay. So a couple of things you guys are going to need to know to follow along with the animation that I'm going to show you. First of all, when you guys see a star pop up on the screen, what that denotes is a human community that's living together and reproducing within their community, sort of in geographic isolation from other communities. When you see that star change color, what that means is that a long period of time is passing, and that group is evolving over that period of time, genetically speaking. Okay, so let's say we have our early group of humans here in the Rift Valley, and at some point, a group breaks off from that initial group, migrates across the very vast northern part of the African continent over into, say, what's now modern day Senegal. So at this point, what we have are two groups of humans that are living in geographic isolation from one another, but that are initially genetically indistinct from one another. Over time, since they're evolving in isolation from one another, what happens? They become genetically distinct from one another since they're in isolation. So later on, we have another group that breaks off from the original Rift Valley group, now later in time, and moves across the Middle East and Western Asia into, let's say, what's now modern day China. So again, we now have two groups that initially are genetically indistinct from one another. They came from that same source group, but that are now living in geographic isolation. So what happens? These three groups continue to evolve over time, but that group that's in what's now modern day China and the group in East Africa share a more recent common ancestor than the group in East Africa shares with the group in West Africa. So even though the two African groups are on the same continent, they're actually farther apart, genetically speaking, than the group in Asia and the group in East Africa. So we used to think about racial groups and continental ancestry like this. They're all totally distinct from one another with some overlap from people having babies across those groups. But what we now know is this, because, and this makes sense from what we've just talked about with early patterns of human migration, because people have been evolving on the African continent longer than anywhere else, we know that non-Africans are a subset, genetically speaking, of the much larger and more genetically diverse group of Africans. So all non-Africans are a subset of people of African descent, genetically speaking. So this is, let's just like highlight this point for a second. This is a very different way of thinking about race, genetics, and ancestry than the medical community thought about these things for a very, very, very long time. So you could be a person who's living in modern day, let's say Kenya, and there may be a person living in modern day China with whom you are more closely genetically related than you are to a person who lives in modern day Namibia. So let's think about this in terms of some genetic diseases. So let's start with Tay Sachs disease. So Tay Sachs disease is a genetic disease, as we all know. Let's say we're studying Tay Sachs disease in Brooklyn, and specifically in the Crown Heights neighborhood. This is where I would usually be like, hey, is anyone from New York? Let's like raise our hands and high five a little bit, but we're on Zoom, so we can't really do that. So I'm from New York. Anyhow, yay, Brooklyn. So this was the racial makeup of the Crown Heights neighborhood on a recent census. And among that 18% white population, about 80% of that group is Ashkenazi Jewish. And this is a group that meaningfully shares ancestry and has some genetic homogeneity. So if we're studying Tay Sachs disease here, what would we see? We would see that it's relatively prevalent among the white community in the neighborhood and probably pretty much absent among everybody else. So that might lead us to say, okay, well, so whiteness is a reasonable proxy for likelihood of having Tay Sachs disease. But that doesn't sound quite right? Like we just have an implicit understanding that that whiteness and that just like doesn't sound right? So whiteness is not a good proxy because we kind of implicitly know that white people are incredibly genetically diverse. Ashkenazi Jews are only one community within that much larger white group. And so it doesn't make sense that whiteness would be a good proxy for a genetic disease. We just kind of get that. We're sort of acculturated to understand that and to think that way. So let's think about sickle cell disease. Very similarly, this is another genetic disease where you have to inherit 2 copies of the gene to have the disease. So this is areas where sickle cell disease is endemic, and we all kind of learned in medical school the relationship between sickle cell disease, heterozygosity, and immunity to malaria, which is why sickle cell disease is fairly endemic across the malaria belt. So, this is the prevalence of sickle cell disease, and this is where malaria is endemic. So this is the average skin tone in this region of the world. Okay, so what do we see here? We see that across this part of the world, sickle cell disease tracks much more closely with malaria endemicity than it does with skin tone. So in the US, we often talk about and are sort of taught to think about Blackness and sickle cell disease as being somewhat like closely related to one another, right? We think about Blackness as sort of a proxy for risk of having sickle cell disease. Now, across the malaria belt, what we see is that Blackness is actually really not a good proxy for risk of having sickle cell disease. The two don't track very closely together. Now, what do we know in the United States? In the United States, our Black population is somewhat skewed. Most of our Black population in the US does have ancestors that have come from parts of Western and Central Africa that are in the malaria belt. And we have relatively fewer people who do not experience life as Black who are from the malaria belt. So in the United States, we've sort of been acculturated to think about Blackness as a proxy for risk of having sickle cell disease. But in the rest of the world, that doesn't really work, right? It's actually just a coincidence of geography and migration that much of our population in the United States with sickle cell disease is Black. So some people might think, well, I'm going to practice my whole career in the United States. And if in the United States, almost everyone with sickle cell disease is Black, and there's an association between the two, why does it matter? So the reason it matters is because, first of all, we run the risk of missing sickle cell disease in people who are not Black, but who are from areas of the world that are part of the malaria belt. And the second reason this is so important is because when we talk about a genetic disease in terms of race, and we see that race is a proxy for having a genetic disease, what we're doing is reinforcing this really harmful and totally false and unscientific notion that race is rooted in genetics. That's the most problematic reason. That's the most problematic part of continuing to talk about sickle cell disease in these terms. So just like we implicitly understand that whiteness is not a proxy for risk of having Tay Sachs disease, we need to think about Blackness in the same way in relation to sickle cell disease. Okay, so race, just like genetics, is neither a equivalent to nor a good proxy for ancestry. So let's talk about this. So let's think about Barack Obama and Tracy Ellis Ross. So Barack Obama, his father was Luo Kenyan. So that's a very specific tribe located in East Africa that does share meaningful genetic homogeneity. His mother was a white woman of mixed European ancestry. Couldn't find any more details about that. So he considers himself Black. That is the racial group that he identifies with as most closely mirroring his social experience. This is Tracy Ellis Ross. Her father is Ashkenazi Jewish, and her mother is Diana Ross. And the Ross family believe themselves to be descended from people brought from West Africa as slaves, and they don't have a whole lot more detail about that aspect of their background. So similarly, Tracy Ellis Ross identifies as Black. That is the social experience that most closely mirrors her own social experience. So both of these people identify as Black. They share their racial group, but they don't actually share any ancestry, do they? Because in the case, even thinking about the sort of African portion of their ancestors, we have one person whose ancestors are Luo Kenyan, East African, and we have another person whose ancestors are very likely all from Western and Central Africa. And as we saw in our sort of anthropology map from the early days of human migration, those ancestors very likely don't share any sort of common relative until far, far, far earlier than many other people who we would not consider in any way closely related. So they share their race, they do not share their ancestry. This is Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor. She's Puerto Rican. And we know that Puerto Ricans are 90% descended from Spanish settlers, with the remaining 10% being descended from indigenous groups on the island, as well as people forcibly brought from West Africa as slaves. So she considers herself Latina. That is her life experience. This is Alexis Bledal. Alexis Bledal's father is Argentine. Argentines are largely descended from Dutch and German immigrants. And her mother is or was an American woman of mixed European ancestry who grew up, lived her entire childhood in Mexico City, and only spoke Spanish until adulthood. So Alexis Bledal grew up speaking Spanish in the home, and culturally, her family was sort of Argentine and Mexican. So she identifies as Latina as well. Again, just looking back at the ancestral makeup of these two individuals and the places that they came from, they don't actually share any ancestry, do they? Even though they share their racial group. So this is Ofra Haza. She was a Yemeni Jew. So like many people that we've seen, that's a group that shares meaningful genetic homogeneity. She is often referred to as the Madonna of the Middle East. She lived most of her adult life in Israel and was a singer and performer. And she died many years ago. I've never seen anything that says what group she personally identified as, but we can look at her and make an educated guess that she would experience life in the United States, most likely as a white person. So this is the Madonna of everywhere else, and she is Italian and French Canadian. So again, I haven't seen her say this specifically, but I'm guessing Madonna would identify as white. So we have two people who very likely share their racial group. One is Yemeni Jewish. The other is Italian and French Canadian. So again, there's no shared ancestry there. So we can look at these 6 individuals, and most likely there is ancestral commonality between these racial groups more than among individual groups. So just to hammer this point in, these girls are fraternal twins. They very literally share all of their ancestry. Yet we can make an educated guess that one of them will likely experience life as a white person, and one will likely experience life as a Black person. So I've had colleagues say, I hear this, I get it, race is a social experience, but what do I do with what I see? Why is it that when I look at two people, I can identify that they're part of a different racial group than mine. They're the same group as each other. And they look more similar to me than two people who belong to my own racial group. And this is typically a white person who's asking this type of question. So there actually is a very good explanation for that phenomenon, and it's called the cross-race effect. So what this is that our memory for faces of our own racial or ethnic group is much better than our memory for faces of other groups. We see a finer grain of detail when we look at faces that belong to people who are part of our own group than when we look at faces of people who belong to another group. So let's chew on that for a second. Why do we do this? The theory goes like this. When we were early humans, out in the world, in the outdoors, if we encountered another person, what did we need to know? The first thing we needed to know is this person part of my group, my clan, or are they not? If they're not part of my group, I don't care who they are as an individual. They're automatically a threat. I'm done. If they are part of my group, my family, my clan, it is useful information for me to be able to know who that person is as an individual and to be able to differentiate them from their brother, the person next door, etc. So when we're looking at someone who looks somewhat similar to us, who's part of our kind of larger clan, we individuate. We look at details in their face and we figure out who that person is as an individual in a way that we do not when we're looking at faces from people from other groups. This has actually been studied in functional MRI studies. So different parts of our brain light up when we are looking at faces of people who belong to our own racial or ethnic group compared to when we're looking at someone who belongs to a different group. This pattern of sort of thinking and processing faces has been noted among different ethnic groups all over the world. So this is something that's very, very consistent. And this has been studied for over 50 years, mostly in fields like criminology for obvious reasons. It's very well known that when an eyewitness is being asked to identify a perpetrator, they are much more likely to misidentify that person if that person is of a different racial group than if that person belongs to the eyewitness's racial group. But this is not something that really has made it into the medical literature. So I'm guessing most of us have never heard of it before. So this is an example. Lucy Liu and Lisa Ling are misidentified for each other all the time, and they're both very perplexed by this. So when we look at them next to each other, we look at their faces and we see these two women actually really don't look at all alike, but people who are non-Asian very often remember them and think of them as sort of the same person. So we have a question. Is this effect observed in minority people who grow up within a different race majority, i.e. people of Asian descent in the US or someone who is white who grows up in Asia? Great question. So yes, it is, but it's not quite as strong. So in the United States, where white people make up a majority of the population, and there's a clear sort of power differential there, people of minority groups still have the same cross-race effect within their group, but it's not quite as strong as it is among white people looking at other white people in the US. And that holds true also for people who are adopted. So let's say we have an Asian child adopted into a white family. That Asian person still exhibits a similar cross-race effect, but it's nowhere near as strong for their own sort of in-group as it is if they were to grow up in an Asian family. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. No problem. Yeah, please feel free to put questions in the chat. So there's also sort of this idea out there of like an African phenotype, which is really just totally false. So what do we see here? We see portraits of individuals who are from all across the African continent, and we see a huge range of different facial features, hair textures, kind of size, orientation, distribution of facial features. Like there's really no individual phenotype. We even see a huge range of skin tones. So we may not see anyone who is as light-skinned as some of the lightest skinned people on the planet, but it's not like everyone here has a similar skin tone at all. So this idea of the African phenotype is just really kind of false. So despite this, we might look at someone like author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Okay, and so many of us would look at her and we may be able to sort of subconsciously identify that this cluster of facial features is typical of a group that lives somewhere on the African continent, even if we can't identify that her features are fairly typical of the Igbo Nigerian group specifically. And we would also look at Ethiopian President Saleh Work Zewde, and we would also subconsciously be able to recognize that her particular cluster of features belongs to a group that lives somewhere on the African continent, but most of us wouldn't necessarily be able to immediately identify these features as very typical of Abyssinian Ethiopians. So that subconscious recognition of each of these women as being part of some African group then leads us to draw conclusions about them being closely related to one another, even though they look absolutely nothing like one another. They look as different as many white people look from one another, where we wouldn't assume that they're related, or as people who are part of different racial groups look to one another. So delving into skin color some more, many of us will look at this gentleman who is from Southern Asia, and despite the fact that his skin is very dark, we would be able to recognize that his cluster of features belong to a group that is not from the African continent and that is from somewhere in Southern Asia. And so we would we would not categorize him as Black despite him having very dark skin. Now, what about these women? So if these women were walking down the street in the United States, I would guess that most people would not recognize their particular cluster of features, would fall back on skin color as a result, would categorize them as Black, and would then make subconscious assumptions about their being closely related ancestrally to other people who they would identify as Black. Yet these two women are Aboriginal Australian, and their features are very typical of Aboriginal Australians. So Aboriginal Australians' ancestors left the African continent far earlier than many other groups that left and populated other parts of the world, evolved to be what we would now consider white and Asian. And so basically these women, even though they have dark skin, they are not any more closely related to Africans than people who would not be considered Black. So, again, we fall back on skin color and use that to make assumptions about relationships when we can't identify immediately a cluster of features. Now, what about these kids? So I moved to the Pacific Northwest in 2013. And before moving to the Pacific Northwest, I hadn't encountered a lot of people from the Pacific Islands. Now I know many people from the Pacific Islands. They're part of my community. And so before I moved here, I think if I had encountered these kids out in the world, I probably would have categorized them subconsciously as Black based on their having dark skin. Yet now, if I saw them, I would implicitly identify them as belonging to a Pacific Islander group, even if I didn't automatically recognize that they are Samoan. So again, we fall back on skin tone when we don't recognize other features. So I will also ask you all, if these individuals were signing up for care at Harborview and they were, given their questionnaire and were filling out the box of racial group, which box do you think they would check? And what does that box tell us about their genetic background versus their social experience? And what does it tell us about any common experience versus common biology with each other or with other individuals who check the same box as them? So I would say the answer to that is we're probably not really sure because we don't really know what box they would check. We don't give a lot of direction in this. Are we telling people to check a box having to do with continental ancestry, Social experience, people don't know. We don't give any guidance. This is all just really very haphazard. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this definition. It's very hard to define race as anything more precise than this, a lifelong social experience. So let's delve into how we use race as a variable in medicine. So this was the earliest US census. In 1790, these were the racial categories that were used. And in the 2010 census, these were the racial categories that were used. So what we see are categories that are socially salient at the particular time that they're being used. The categories used in the US Census have changed just about every 10 years, every time we've done the US Census, to match those categories that are socially salient in the moment. So this is not like a fixed biological thing. This is not age. This is not sex. This is not a measurable number like blood pressure. This is something that's very, very malleable. So how do we apply these concepts in patient care? So let's think through a case to talk through some of this. So I'm just going to click through and let you guys read this. Okay, so ding, 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 this guy has a DVT and you are going to put him on medication for that. And he just says, okay, doc, I just want something that is easy to take, that I only have to take once a day. So your go-to medication is going to be rivaroxaban. And like many medications, it's considered safe to use above a certain GFR. So we remember this guy's creatinine was 2.5. He has chronic kidney disease. So we would probably say, I don't know where his GFR is. Let's calculate that. Okay, so let's go through these. Sex, male, Black. Is he Black? I'm not sure. Let's hypothetically say yes. His age, 47, creatinine, we've measured that. So these are all very clearly defined categories other than race. So if we say yes, then his GFR is 34. So it's like decently over our GFR cutoff. And if we say no, then it's 29. So that's a clinically relevant difference. So let's digress for a second. Until fairly recently, this is what we saw in EPIC and the now defunct ORCA when we would look in our medical record to figure out someone's GFR. So if we look back at our calculator, it says Black race. If we look here, it says African American and European American. Black and African American, not the same thing, right? Yet we use these terms haphazardly and interchangeably in a way that's like so imprecise and so unscientific that we wouldn't tolerate in the medical community with most other things. This also begs the question, okay, African American and European American, what about everybody else? And were the studies really done? Were they done with people who checked the box for Black or African American? We don't know. It's just kind of a mess, right? The other thing that happens is that when you look at this every day for multiple patients for years and years and years, this reinforces the idea of there being African American people and European Americans. But so that's what it says. But the way that we've been sort of acculturated to think about this is Black people and everybody else. And that's a really powerful way that we other and sort of disenfranchise a huge group of our patients and reinforce these kind of subconscious notions to ourselves. So thankfully, thanks to the efforts of medical students who spearheaded all of this and did all the work, we don't see this anymore. We don't have these two categories anymore in EPIC, but they do still exist in many a medical record across the country. And they're what we saw day after day, year after year for many, many years until just, I think it was like a year and a half or 2 years ago. So some basics about GFR to follow along for the next several slides. We can actually measure GFR by administering an exogenous substance that is only cleared by the kidneys and then measuring output in the kidneys and serum levels until that substance is totally gone. So this is obviously very cumbersome, expensive, and not practical to do on a day-to-day basis. That's why physicians have developed several different equations to estimate GFR using readily available variables. So I'm going to talk about the CKD-EPI equation, and that's because that is the most recently developed one that's used in many places in the United States. And by being most recent, it should reflect our most up-to-date thinking about these things. So if we're trying to figure out for our patient, do we click yes or no for the Black variable? How do we define his GFR, and can we prescribe rivaroxaban? What we need to think about is who was studied when this equation was developed, why there's the race correction in the first place, and then finally we can ask the question, does this apply for my patient? So for who was studied, there were 10 studies used to develop the equation and 16 used to validate it. In these source studies, as well as in the paper on CKD-EPI, race is not defined. So we don't know how the data were gathered as to the racial groups of the patients. We can make an educated guess that something like this was given to the patients to check a box. So let's note this category. So all of these studies were done in the United States. If we're using the term Black, then that applies to people outside of the United States as well. So that's actually a much, much larger category and broader and more sort of geographically diverse category than what is actually represented in the study, which is people in the United States who would check this box. So again, like none of this is discussed or defined in the paper, but we can make an educated guess that this group were people in the United States specifically. So why do we use a race correction? So what researchers were trying to account for was this. In the United States, it has been observed that at a given creatinine, people who check the box for Black, on average, have a higher measured GFR than people who check the box for white. We do not know why this phenomenon happens. So they're trying to account for that. This is what they say in the CKD-EPI paper to sort of explain the use of a race correction. They said the CKD-EPI equation includes age, race, and sex as surrogates for non-GFR determinants of serum creatinine. These variables are associated with muscle mass, the main determinant of creatinine generation. So race is used as a proxy for muscle mass. So what happens if we follow this reference? If we follow this reference, what we see is a paper describing the relationship between age, sex, pregnancy status, muscle wasting disorders, and muscle mass. Nowhere in this paper is race discussed. We see this all over the medical literature, this idea that race is a proxy for muscle mass. It's become so culturally ingrained that this is true, that Black people have higher muscle mass, that you can publish a new calculator in a very high-profile journal that becomes used all over the country without even backing up this notion that race is associated with muscle mass. So when I was developing this talk, I delved in deep into the literature to try to find evidence supporting this idea of there being a relationship between race and muscle mass, and specifically supporting the idea that Black people have higher muscle mass. What I found was one paper from 1985 done in a single center in Arizona with 150 Black patients. And it was part of their inclusion criteria that people had to be able to say that their ancestors were African American going back several generations, all of their ancestors. So one center, 1985, 100 patients whose ancestors shared a particular experience in the United States. And this has led to this notion that we use over and over and over, and we don't even think about anymore. So that's just like kind of bananas, isn't it? So another thing that we need to talk about here is that this phenomenon, this difference in measured GFR in relation to a specific creatinine, and there being a difference in association with race, is not seen in other parts of the world. So specifically in South Africa, Congo, and several other countries, they have found this not to be true. So the race correction doesn't actually help with estimates of GFR, and they don't use it. So therefore, what does that tell us? That tells us it's not race. If this were race alone, we would see the same thing in other places. There's some other reason that this is happening in the United States. And our next question really should be, what explains this difference? Let's figure it out. Is there something about life experience, access to healthcare, financial situation, experience of the stress of racism, any other factor that could explain this phenomenon? Is there something else? If we just make these assumptions about race and muscle mass and move on, then we totally lose the opportunity to learn something new and to provide much better care to our patients. So again, because we've been so acculturated to think this way, we lose the opportunity to do that discovery and to improve patient care, and we perpetuate health inequity. So does this apply to our patient? Does this race correction apply to our patient? What if he's African-American for several generations? Well, again, we can, make that educated guess, since those source studies were done in the United States, that most of the people in that category that checked the box for Black were sort of Black Americans. So maybe this person somewhat fits that category. What if he's biracial? We just have absolutely no idea what to do with this, because it is completely not captured in the way that we collect data on race in medical studies. I think there's just absolutely no answer here. What if he's an Ethiopian immigrant? How many Ethiopian immigrants do we think were in that group that checked the box for Black or not? We have no idea. I mean, probably very few, just thinking about demographics. So there may be something about the experience of being an Ethiopian immigrant in the US that's salient here. There may be something genetic about that particular, or about a particular ethnic group coming from Ethiopia that's relevant, but this is probably not captured in those racial categories. So what do I actually do? So I will say, just to not leave you guys hanging, I think about GFR as a range for everybody. So if I'm using that calculator, what I do is I click yes and no for Black race for every single patient. So I think about GFR as a range. If that range doesn't cross a threshold that would change my clinical decision-making, then I can kind of move on. And if it does, then I stop for a minute and I think harder about, like, okay, what are the implications of my thinking about this person's GFR as being on the lower end versus the higher? Like, can I prescribe this medication safely? What else do I need to think about? What conversation do I need to have with the patient? So this is not to totally pick on the nephrologists here. This way of thinking about race and using it as a variable in this very haphazard and unscientific way is part of nearly all medical research. And in fact, you have to stratify your data by race to get most sources of funding. And there's pretty much no guidance anywhere about how to collect data about race well, and there's no expectation to sort of write in your paper about what categories you used, why, what you're thinking about that is. This is done in pretty much every discipline in science and medicine. Race is never defined, and it's used as a proxy for all kinds of other things besides muscle mass. And what we tend to do when we see a difference in outcome or in physiology in association with race is we make some sort of very vague statement, like, after controlling for other variables, race was still significant, and we move on. That implies that race is something fundamental to the patient in the way that age is, in the way that sex is, in the way that a measurable number like blood pressure is. And we lose the opportunity to then ask the next question and to say, okay, well, race is the social phenomenon. So we need to figure out what aspect of that is actually the underlying factor that leads us to see this difference. So again, if there's one thing that you guys remember, I hope it's the fact that race captures a lifelong social experience. It's very hard to define it as anything else, and it's certainly impossible to define it as anything very scientifically concrete. So this and the cross-race effect should be your number one and your number two conclusions here. So some recommendations: avoid equating race with genetics or ancestry. So if you're conducting research, be specific about who is in your study, who's in those different groups, and what are some of the drawbacks of the ways that you've collected that information? What are some of the limitations? And if you're reading and interpreting a study in order to make a clinical decision, be thoughtful about who was included in the study that you're reading, and again, what the limitations are of the way that racial data was collected, and that will help you figure out how to use, or more likely kind of not to use, that aspect of the information. Avoid using race as a proxy for physiology like muscle mass. In my humble opinion, it's never necessary. There's always a better way to figure out how to include physiologic data in your study. We can use race. We should not totally throw out the concept of race, right? There's something very important there about life experience, stress associated with race, exposures, etc. So we can use race in epidemiologic studies to characterize, to understand health inequity. We should never be using it, however, when we're trying to learn something about a person's biology. So I think this is something that that a lot of people used to think about as sort of a niche interest, like, oh, some people are into study social determinants of health or are interested in health equity. No, we can't do that anymore. It is all of our collective responsibility to start to shift our perspective on race in the medical community. That's the only way that we will, as a community, start to think about, talk about, and teach about race differently, and totally change the way that it's woven into the fabric of our community in the future and into our culture. Okay, so that's the end, and we've got a little bit of time for questions. John or others, what time do you guys need to go to break?
So we're just going to wrap up at 11:30. So we have about a minute.
Great. Okay, questions, comments, stories?
I actually have a quick question.
Sure.
So when you're using race in a clinical statement, should we, and let's say like you don't have the patient identification or they did not identify themselves to us. So how should we do it? Because like, as you mentioned, it's important to put it in our equation because it can represent like an equity or other issues rather than like actually being medically related. But are we like always making an educated guess? But if we are, then we're always making it based on skin color, or are we not doing that unless we really have what the patient identified their like social experience has?
So that is a super important question. Thank you for asking that. So I would say that it's pretty much never a good idea to include race in your clinical identifier, because what it does is it brings up all kinds of biases for the person reading that statement before they've learned anything else about the patient. And like we learned, it really doesn't tell us anything about the person's biology. So everything else in your clinical presentation, whether it's your note, whether it's your one-liner for a consultant, whether it's a presentation on rounds, that's what you you should be listening to try to understand that individual's kind of health status. Race is going to take you away from that. What race can tell you is something about their life experience, but it's so variable that instead of race, what you should have is something in the social history about the person's life experience. So I do, as I get to know my patients in primary care, I do ask them about experiences with sort of racism or discrimination in the healthcare system, because that is relevant for me to understand their perspective and some of the, baggage or otherwise that they bring to the clinical setting. But if I'm like calling a nephrologist and saying this person has like really severe acute kidney failure, that should be down. Like that shouldn't be, just their race alone isn't going to tell them very much about the extent of that experience and isn't the first thing that they need to know. More important than any of this, though, is that if you are ever going to include race, I want you to have a really, really deep discussion with yourself about why you're including it, what you're communicating, and why is it important enough to be included in that particular spot. If it's one of the first things that a person knows about that patient, it's going to drop so many biases and totally skew their thinking about that patient's case. So I would say don't do it.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah, sure. I will also say people have all kinds of different opinions on this, and I think it's a good idea to just talk to your colleagues about what they do and why, and sort of hone your own practice on this. We don't all have to do this the exact same way.
Yeah, thank you so much for answering the question. I think my question is coming from when we were preparing the cases for the earlier discussion. One of our question has like, a Black patient, and the reason why we identify race is basically it's kind of the point of the question to discuss equity. But I was just wondering if there should be like a different way of bringing it, because like the main reason of the vignette was to discuss inequity, so this is why it's highlighted. But as you mentioned, probably in other scenarios like pure clinical, then no. If you're discussing other issues, then yes. But if yes, like, is it fair to do it based on our like assumption that this is how this person would identify as, if we don't have their own specific identification? If that makes, my question makes sense.
So I think that's a really good example, I will say, of when you're using race in that clinical vignette. You're using it for a very specific purpose, like you say, which is that's a specific part of your discussion for a learning setting. So that's the reason that you're using it, and that does make sense to me to use it. In terms of which racial category you're giving that patient, I think you should just say self-identifies as, X, or appears to be X. It feels awkward to do it because that's not the way that we've usually done it, but that's actually better information than to just pick one and say it without specifying where that information is coming from. If every medical study did that, then we would have a much better idea of like, oh, this is how this person is seen in this clinical setting versus this is what this person is telling us about their life experience, because those are two slightly different things, right? So yeah, I would say just be specific about what piece of information you're using.
That's very helpful.
And I see there's been a movement in the Asian American community to de-aggregate census data on ethnicity, since the East Asian versus Southeast Asian diaspora tends to have different social economic experiences. I'm curious if you've seen a similar movement in medical literature and any clinical impacts that may have. I would say this is just all one giant mess, because again, data on race has been taken in such a haphazard way where studies don't define or give us any information on how it's collected. So it's super imprecise, and it's really impossible to apply it to the care of any individual patient, because like we don't know who is in those different groups. So let's see, have I seen a similar movement in medical literature? I guess I've seen a big movement of people trying to do a better job of collecting these types of data, I haven't seen anything firm. Like there's still just a lot of discussion on like how should we do this? And really not a lot of conclusions yet. So conversation very much ongoing. We're taking baby steps. Yes. And like, let's just acknowledge that, right? Like, let's acknowledge that we're in a phase of kind of learning and discovery and collaboration and conversation. So let's not try to make this information what it's not, which is something that's precise and scientific and can be applied in a meaningful way clinically.
I guess I have a question if no one
Sure,
has.
yeah, go for it.
I was just trying to give space to other people, but I really have a question in my mind.
Yes.
So about the cross race effect, I'm trying to frame the question the right way. So would you, or is there a difference between this effect if we look at it in a diverse population or a diverse country versus if we look in a more like enclosed population where everyone within the same ethnicity? And the reason I'm asking this question, because I grew up in Syria and pretty much like everyone around me looked like me.
Yeah.
And when I came here, I think initially it was hard for me to recognize other people's features, even like including white, or any ethnicity, like not really specific to anyone. And I think with time, I kind of gained like either knowledge or just like a sense of noticing and became more able to distinguish people's features. I mean, on the contrast, like I know when my grandma visits here, she cannot make the difference between any other ethnicity other than our own like smaller group. And I don't think this is coming from like a bad notion. I just think it just has to do with this effect. And I wonder if there's like actual data behind it.
Yes, so this is very much hardwired into our biology. It's in fact not your grandmother's fault. Like her brain is hardwired to think this way. So we have seen that in people who are exposed to a more diverse range of phenotypes, they are better at recognizing and individuating faces across a diverse range of phenotypes than someone who's only used to seeing kind of a very homogeneous population. So they're better at it, but they're still not that good. So in other words, someone who grew up in, let's say Queens, in like a super, super diverse elementary school, their friends, their neighbors, their teachers, everyone they interact with is from many different groups. That person is going to be a little better at individuating faces that belong to racial groups that are not their own than someone who grew up, let's say like, I don't know, I'll give it some, since you're giving yourself as an example, then you having grown up in a much more homogeneous setting. But they're still not going to be that good. They're still going to do a better job of differentiating faces that belong to their own group.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And like, I don't like it that this phenomenon exists. I really wish it didn't, but I think it's so important that we all know about it, because that will prevent us from developing this mentality of like, oh, for me, I'll say, oh, like I'm a white person, like white people phenotypically are so much more diverse than non-white people. And it's like, well, that's not true. That's just because that's how my brain works when I see other people out in the world. Okay. So if we know about this phenomenon, then it sort of breaks down some of that inclination to think about that being like part of biology.
Yeah. It's very interesting. And I will tell you, it's very interesting how I like became more able to notice the difference in people features, because even like European whites look very similar to me initially, because I grew up with people who share more like similar features to me. And I don't know, I've personally like always identify others because I don't feel like I fit within any of the category presented to me. But what I'm trying to say is, although like other people may say like, oh, I look white. I don't personally identify as white anyways. But yeah, but it's like within all the different populations. It's very interesting, really.
Yeah. All right. Well, if anyone has any more questions or comments or anything else, I'm always available by email. It's Shike, SHIKE @uw.edu. And please just keep talking to each other about all this stuff. That's how we all grow and learn and sort of change our culture and our community. So that's it. All right. Bye, guys.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shike.
You're
Thanks,
welcome.
everyone.
Dr. Shike, and thanks to the RDC for a great session today. We'll see you all next week.